Hi everyone, I'm Jaime Singer with Rel Midwest, and I am among other things, the lead for all of our training, coaching, and technical support work. So I'm really excited to talk to all of you today about this important work and a little bit about some strategies for sharing evidence and data throughout systems. And I love, Alan and Kara, your image about the hippos dancing, as I would like a printout of that slide on my wall, making the hippos dance. So we'll talk a little bit about that and hopefully ways that we can make sure that they don't lumber around with lots of data that isn't being used, but we have some sort of choreographed dance among them. So we'll talk about some strategies that we can use, but first I want to take a step back and think about, and this kind of relates to what Alan and Kara were talking about too, ask a few questions of yourself before we start thinking through the actual strategies that you'll use. So first, we'll start with the what. So what are you trying to impart or communicate to people? Do you want to provide information to them about findings that you have from a research study? Do you want to share plans about collecting data that you're doing? So you want to start with that clearly defined plan to help determine the best way to actually communicate about it. So starting with that what is where you want to focus your attention at first. And then next up is the who. So who is your audience? And the more you can narrow down on your audience, the more effective your message will be. So throwing information out into the world and hoping that it sticks is not the best way to go about thinking about these strategies to support evidence use, but starting by really sitting down, thinking about who are we trying to target and what's the best entry point to make sure that it is successful when we are actually communicating with them. Which brings me to the third question, the why. So why are you communicating in this? Why are you sharing that piece of information with that particular audience? Why is it important for them? And then so what? So if I'm your audience and you've shared information with me, I should have a clear idea of what I should do about it. So if you are sharing to impart knowledge, that's going to look very different from if you're sharing to persuade or sharing to help a stakeholder make a decision. So thinking about what it is that you want to share very specifically, who the audience is, why you're sharing it with that audience, and then what do you want them to eventually do about it. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about this framework called the innovation decision process. So as you can see on the screen, the framework has 5 stages to the process: knowledge, persuasion, decision, implementation, and confirmation. So when you're thinking about what you would like your stakeholders to achieve by sharing your research, sharing your evidence, sharing your data, this is a great place to start the conversation. So as I said previously, if you're interested in imparting knowledge to your audience, you're exposing them to evidence, which might look very different from if you're sharing research for decision making, which is also going to look very different from if you're sharing information to support implementation. And we'll talk through several examples to kind of get a sense of what those different things will look like. So we'll use this to frame how you want to accomplish success basically in sharing your different resources or in sharing your different pieces of information. So before we do that though, I want to talk about the different ways that we can engage our audiences. And for the RELs, we break this down into 4 areas of training, coaching, tool development, and dissemination. So when we talk about training, we're talking about really building the technical and content knowledge of the audience. And this can be through a one-time training session or a series of sessions that takes place over a period of time, but you're basically imparting knowledge to your audience. For coaching, this is where you're working more closely with a specific group of people, a specific group of stakeholders, and you're really working deeply on a particular topic over perhaps a longer period of time, but really diving deep into that topic. For tool development, this could include developing things such as guides for explaining how to do something. It could be a template or a tool for conducting research or for understanding and analyzing data. And then in terms of dissemination, you may include things such as blogs, newsletters, social media posts, public TV, or webinars like the one we're on right now. So how do you put all this together? So you want to take all the information that you brainstormed previously about your audience, what you want them to do with it, what sort of behavior change you want to see, combine that with the strategies and determine what makes the most sense. So we can think through this in terms of the 5 stages in the process and kind of think about, you know, if you have identified that you want to share information with a broad audience and your primary purpose is to increase their knowledge, then writing a blog post might be the best strategy. Whereas if you want to share evidence with an audience and have them actually implement something, you might need to do something more intensive, such as training, developing tools, or coaching. So for each of these stages, I'll share an example of how Rel Midwest has engaged our audiences. For when we want to share information, as I mentioned previously, with a large audience, and we're really trying to just impart knowledge, we're getting information out into the world, we might write a blog post. And there's an example of one that we did in April that focused on coordinating early childhood state data. So this will go out to our listserv, post on the website. It might also be shared more directly with a stakeholder who's particularly interested in that topic. If we're focused on persuading an audience and want to encourage their learning, then we might do a training session. And an example of this was with the Cleveland Partnership for English Learner Success. We facilitated a one-day research agenda setting workshop for the district staff. And this workshop really allowed the district staff to identify and prioritize their research topics, develop the research agenda, and put everything together into the research agenda. So it was a one-day session, helping them work through something that they would then interact with longer term. If we're trying to help stakeholders make a decision, we might present information in a checklist, such as the survey development guidance checklist. So using this checklist, this is something that stakeholders could use on their own. They can follow the steps within the checklist and figure out what will be on their survey and determine who the audience will be for the survey and how it will be disseminated. If we're trying to support implementation of evidence, we may engage in a coaching project. Again, this is really going deeper into a specific topic. And as an example of this, we work with the Michigan Department of Education on a coaching project for organizational learning. The Michigan Department of Education right now is working to implement their top 10 in 10-year strategic plan. So Rel Midwest is working with the deputy leadership team and other key stakeholders within the department to determine how best to use their data and evidence to ensure that they are achieving their plan. So this is an example of an exit ticket, and you can see there's a question on here that helps the staff really figure out if how they're using data, reflecting on that, so provides them with some information about that. And then also gives the Rel Midwest coach some information to help push the coaching participants forward and make sure that we're all on track for them achieving their goals. And finally, when we're intending to confirm and solidify a change in practice for our stakeholders, we may refer them to a clearinghouse. And so the panel that is going to come up and talk next is a great example of how we have worked with stakeholders to better understand the clearinghouses that exist and also how they align with the ESSA tiers of evidence. So I will go ahead and turn it over to them.